Hey guys, Karl Bainbridge welcoming you back to INC Live, and in the words of Jason Derulo, I am riding solo for this one. So we were hoping to try and do a preview show for UFC 312. Unfortunately, Joe has a lot of prior commitments. We wanted to record this on the Sunday, but he was very unwell. He phoned me up and he was just spluttering all over, so I thought it's not fair on him to try and record a preview show in that condition. So I'm going to try and do this one myself. I won't go into the full card, unfortunately, but main and the co-main in particular, I will be devoting a little bit of time towards. So, UFC 312 is going to be taking place this Saturday over in Australia, and there's often a lot of stereotypes when it comes to the UFC and these overseas cards. Kind of get the feeling that the UFC know that the local fans will tune in regardless of what kind of card quality they get, and this in my opinion fits right into that bracket. I think the main and the co-main, very interesting fights, and I will go into those in a lot more detail. But you look outside of it, very weak. A lot of local fighters, but not much in terms of, I would say, really relevant matchups. I think you need at least 3 or 4 fights where you can come out of that thinking, what does this impact in its respective weight class? How does this guy move up? I think simply it's a case of, I don't think the Australian talent outside of 1 or 2 big names really lives up to that. And I think we're kind of going through a transition as well when it comes to those Aussie fighters. Izzy obviously just lost this past weekend, so he's maybe not the same fighter, starting to decline. Robert Whittaker coming off a loss. Volkanovski just lost his belt as well. So you could maybe have had Jack Della on there. I know they're saving him for the card in London. But we're really struggling for fresh Australian talent. So Eugene Behrman, City Kickboxing, you need to get on with that. What we do have on the prelims though, there are a couple of names in there which I think are worth keeping an eye out for. Jack Jenkins I think can be a lot of fun. There's 2 in particular. So Wang Tong is a flyweight fighter. You might remember her for one of the biggest upsets of 2024. So she came into the UFC with a ton of fanfare. She held a win over Valentina Shevchenko in kickboxing, but in her second fight with the UFC fought Gabby Fernandez over in China and suffered a big upset. So I think she was like a -1,000 favourite. Gets rocked, gets dropped, and then a rear naked choke. So congratulations to Gabby for that one. And I think this fight for me, she's going up against Bruna Brazil, who's moving up from the Strawweight division. I kind of get the feeling, based on the short turnaround, based off Bruna coming up from a lower weight class, this kind of feels to me like the UFC trying to rewrite that ship, trying to get it back on the rails. And I can see Wang winning that one. I think it's going to be fairly comfortable, but Bruna Brazil, she is training with the Fight Nerds now. Her most recent fight, she fought Molly McCann, and it was the best I'd seen her in the UFC. I do think it's going to be comfortable though, but it's worth keeping an eye out for, and it's going to be interesting to see if the UFC try and act like the Gabby Fernandez fight didn't happen, which we have seen them do several times over. Another name that's sticking out for me, not so much in terms of his actual talent, but in terms of the surname. Alexandre Topuria is going to be making his UFC debut, 6-1 record. Of course, Topuria, he is the brother of Ilia Topuria. Having looked at some of his fights on the regional scene, I think there's some causes for concern. I don't think the quality of his competition is all that high, so the record's a little bit padded. And dare I say, there's a bit of nepotism. I think it's UFC trying to capitalise on Ilia's star right now. Let's get his brother in there. So there have been brothers who have been very successful over the years. You think about the Diaz brothers, you think about the Nogueiras. This is a bit more sort of Francisco Figueiredo or Herbert Burns. And I'm not going to say that Topuria is going to immediately bomb out the UFC, but I think he's got himself a guy in Cody Thickness, which is really going to test his UFC worthiness. Now, Thickness is making his UFC debut as well, taking his fight on short notice. 7-0 record. He was a champion in the Hex Fight series, which is the same place that Steve Ercik won his title. I do have to admit, though, a little bit disappointment. One of the best names in the UFC with Thickness, but I originally read it as Thickness. And of course, when I think of Thickness in the UFC, I thought, yes, Felicia Spencer's back in action. obviously not that case. And Felicia, if you're listening to this one, take it as a compliment. And congratulations as well on having your baby at the first time over at December. Just trying to cover my bases just in case. Normally we would go on these main card fights in a lot more detail, but obviously with this being short notice, me riding solo, people don't want to hear me rabbiting on for about an hour and a half, but don't get your hopes up, I probably will, because I do like to ramble. We will just be going on these main card fights in a little bit of brief detail, see what kind of X's and O's we can work out for each. So, we open up with Jake Matthews taking on the Argentine fighter Francisco Prado. Jake Matthews, who is got a 20-7 record. Now, his most recent fight came at UFC 302 when he beat Phil Rowe. Along with Rowe, you also have wins over Andrea Fiallo, the Joshua Fabia era Diego Sanchez, and probably his biggest win as well, which came against the Leech in another Australian card at UFC 221. While he does have 7 losses on his record, a lot of them have aged fairly well. So Kevin Lee, of course, when he was on these rise up the rankings. Sean Brady's doing very well right now. James Vick, pre-Justin Gaethje. And Michael Morales, who is really turning up the mantle up in the welterweight division as we speak. This is going to be Jake Matthews' 9th main card appearance, and 7 of those have been in Australia. So you can usually get the impression that if Matthews is on an Australian card, he's going to be on the main show. Usually kind of use that as a gauge of how good these Aussie cards actually are. In terms of Prado, it's just going to be his 4th fight, I should say, in the UFC. 1 or 2 so far with a win over Otman Azaitar in the Apex, but also has losses to Jamie Malarkey and Daniel Zellhuber. So Malarkey, another Australian guy, maybe there's a little bit of needle in that. His most recent fight was the loss to Zellhuber on that Mexico card in February 2024. 6 KOs, 6 submissions, and both his losses coming by the way of decision. So you can maybe make an argument that Prado is that kind of kill or be killed fighter, especially in the first round. Very aggressive, uses a lot of lateral movement to corner his opponents. I would make the argument that if the UFC, if MMA fights in the UFC were taking place in a ring, I think Prado with that kind of marauding style would actually play out very, very well, because he is very good at trying to corner people. Loads up heavy on his right hand, a little bit of elements of Leonard Garcia in the way that he fights, but he does take a lot of shots to the body. So I think that's something that Matthews will hopefully try and utilise, along with answering some of those questions regarding Prado's game off his back. When it comes to Jake Matthews, very powerful wrestler. The striking has been making steady improvements, but a lot of people thought by this point in his career, Jake Matthews now, I think 31 years old, the improvements should have already been substantial. While they're a lot better than he was when he came into the UFC, it's still not that elite level. He's just kind of stagnated, and it's kind of reflected with his record so far. I'm expecting Matthews to try and go wrestling heavy as well, but there is some vulnerability when it comes to left hooks. Sean Brady, Matthew Semmelsberger both exploited that in their fights. And I do think that Matthews as well, he kind of relies on his athleticism to bail him out. So I do think that's maybe a bit of a concern when it comes to Matthews. But I do think the grappling advantage is going to play its part here. And I do have concerns over whether or not Prado is able to get the finish if it goes into the later rounds. So there's going to be a danger from Prado early on in this fight. I expect Matthews to be good enough to try and neutralise it. I'm picking him to win by unanimous decision. Moving on to our second fight, and Jimmy Crute returns to action for the first time in over 18 months. He last fought Alonzo Menefield at July 2023. Now that was actually a rematch with Menefield, because them two had an absolute war over one of the Australian cards. Menefield winning the rematch, catching Crute in a submission coming in. But Jimmy Crute was a guy who people had a lot of hype coming into the UFC. So it wins over Paul Craig. He managed to knock out Sam Alvey as well. Mikhail Oleksiejczuk was another one, and Modestas Bukauskas. So pretty solid names, and the losses haven't been too damaging. So you look at people like Misha Serkinov, Jamal Hill, Menefield as mentioned, Anthony Smith. The Smith one, which took place at UFC 261, which I usually have a soft spot for that card, because it was the first one after lockdown, the crowds were back, and it may be up there as one of the best crowd atmospheres I have ever seen for a UFC fight. I really do hope somebody chooses that one on the retro review. He's going to be taking on a guy who's comparatively new to the UFC. Now, people said that Bellator was dead. No, they're still alive. It just comes in the form of a big, burly Brazilian, 12-2 record, Rodolfo Bellator. So, second fight in the UFC. His first came against Ihor Potieria, who I kind of feel he's wrong the UFC because he just keeps getting booked against these powerhouse Brazilians. Ever since he beat Shogun, that's the type of person they always put him against. In terms of Bellator, so 7 KOs, 5 decisions. He was a former champion with the LFA. And his 2 losses came against the same man, which is Vitor Petrino, who's also in the UFC. Bellator, for me, very strange when you look at him physically. So big, hulking, burling bloke of a man. But I do think he's quite light-footed. Powerful low kicks, effective clinch game, likes to utilise his Muay Thai. I would especially look out for his knees. I think that's something the crew's going to have a lot of issues with. But I do think when you have somebody of that kind of size, like Bellator is, I saw this with Alistair Overeem during his sort of TRT Ubereem era. I think when somebody has that bulk, has that build, they start becoming a little bit disdainful of what comes the other way. And we saw that at times when Bellator fought against Potieria, especially when he was staying in the pocket, when he was trying to forward the clinch, trying to make that sort of short-range brawl. What happened? Potieria caught him. And there is a tendency for him to get caught by counters, not only in the UFC, we saw that beforehand as well. So Crute's boxing needs to be on point. Unfortunately, that's a big issue when it comes to Jimmy Crute, because while I think Jimmy Crute is very, very good as a grappler, great top game, it takes something very special to submit Paul Craig. And I think his power-based submissions, you look at stuff like, I think he's got the most Kimuras in the light heavyweight division. So that's a sign that he just goes like these very high torque submissions and he's very good at getting them. But he takes a lot of damage to get there. Very limited striking defense. Anthony Smith pieced him up with a jab. And he does have a tendency to get caught when he's throwing his low kicks. So I think that's something that's maybe a bit of a concern with Crute. I think Bellator has the potential to really tag Crute. You've got to bear in mind the ring rust as well. But Crute may have very well been trying to spend these last 18 months working on his striking substantially. I just have a lot of concerns with Jimmy Crute. I think Jimmy Crute was somebody who had a lot of potential, very similar to Jake Matthews, a very high potential Australian guy who just seemed to sort of hit a level and just stay there and not be able to push forward. So kind of a concern from that end, and it does play on my mind. So I'm picking Bellator to win this one. I think he can catch him in the second round. But I am interested to see what Bellator can do if Crute is able to get the takedown. You have somebody with that kind of bulk. Usually it's a sign that maybe they haven't prepared themselves for the ground game all that much. But I am going to play it safe. I'm going to safe-ish. I'm going to go with Bellator to win this one in the first 2 rounds. Speaking of fighters that are going to struggle getting off their back, that brings us on to Justin Tafa. Now, Mark Hunt was always the guy that people come to when it comes to a big Australian heavyweight brawl that's going to produce a big action fight, big knockout. Tafa seems to have taken up that role and is going to be tested again as he welcomes the UFC newcomer Talison Teixeira into the UFC. So, Justin Tafa obviously is the bigger name of the two, 7-4 record. Has wins in the UFC over the likes of Austin Lane, Parker Porter, Juan Adams as well. So if you have a guy who has a sort of like unranked heavyweight boys stable kind of guy, the likelihood is Justin Tafa has already beaten him. What's also interesting to note as well is that the losses that Tafa's had in the UFC, nearly all of them have come against guys who are no longer there. So you look at people like Jorgen De Castro, the only guy to finish him. You look at people like Carl Williams as well. Now, the Carl Williams one was especially egregious because Carl Williams, powerful wrestler, 3-1 record before he got cut. And you kind of feel like the issue of meritocracy in the UFC, that Justin Tafa can lose to a guy, and yet he's the one that sticks around, where Carl Williams has to ply his trade on the regional scene again. And it does kind of lean into the idea I've personally always had that I think the UFC are becoming much more venomous when it comes to their treatment of wrestlers compared to strikers. Maybe that's always been there. Maybe that's me thinking about it a bit too much. We'll leave that up to you. He is taking on a guy who does have a lot of intrigue around him. So Talison Teixeira, so he most recently fought on the regional scene. All of his wins coming by first round KO, 24 years old, 81-inch reach advantage. There are some question marks over his level of competition, but you look at some of those physical stats, there is a lot of potential there. That being said, a lot of the same things that people are saying about Talison Teixeira, they were saying the same thing about Rebellis to Spain. Is this another guy who's out of his element the moment he gets taken down? If he is, we're not going to find out during this fight because Tarf is going to try and keep this standing. Good explosivity for his size, big knockout power, and I think for a man of his girth, very, very powerful high kicks. We saw that when he fought Harry Hunsucker, where Hunsucker actually had the guard up. He was defending the head kick, but Tarfa hit it with just so much force that he ended up coming down. So that's something that I am going to be interested to see. And I think as well, for me, the big thing with this fight isn't so much about Justin Tafa. It's seeing how good Talison is. Whether this is another to Spain or whether this is somebody who has the potential to maybe be something when it comes to the future. Because 6'7", knows how to use his reach. I am a little bit concerned when it comes to how much he relies on his kicks. He does go to the head a lot, so I think that's something that people can exploit later on. And also as well, when you have a guy who's steamrolling the competition, especially when it comes to heavyweight MMA, because the regional scene is very weak. Like, people complain about the UFC heavyweight division not being all that good. Imagine what regional heavyweight MMA is like. And what you sometimes get is when a young kid's just rolling through his competition, they get into the big game, and the moment they face adversity, they can't handle it. I have seen that happen to a lot of fighters over the years. If somebody is going to crack Talison and going to test how he handles that adversity, it is going to be a guy like Justin Tafa who can crack. I would steer clear of this one if I was a betting man. I just think there's too many unknowns regarding Talison to properly have a guess on how good that's going to be. If I had to choose, I would lean towards him. Getting the finish. And again, when this guy's finishing all his fights by first round knockout, is that because he's legitimately good? Is he putting too much into those early finishes? What's this guy look like in the second round? So stay clear of this one if you're a betting man. If I had to choose, I would lean towards Talison, maybe living up to the hype. But as of now, the ceiling is still quite low for him. But if he gets through this one, and if he does it in the right way, it might be worth keeping an eye on. Co-main event now, and we are moving down to the strawweight division, which is on the line here as the champion Zhang Weili takes on the number one contender Tatiana Suarez. Bookmakers for this one are especially split. Suarez comes in as a -120 favourite. You can get Weili at even odds. That is interesting when you bear in mind what a lot of the polls are saying, including the one over on the INC, where they have Weili with a 69% chance of winning this one. 69% of people picking her to win this fight over the 31 for Tatiana Suarez. And it's a fight as well that I feel could be very pivotal when it comes to the future of the strawweight division, because you could make an argument around sort of 2018, 2019 that strawweight division was by a long way the marquee women's division in the UFC, and dare I say, one of the best divisions in the entire UFC, full stop. But 5 years have passed since then. Things have changed within the weight class. Flyweight has got a lot more prominent. I think the division has lost a lot of luster. We're not at the women's 135 stage where I'm like Wolverine lovingly looking at the picture wondering what went wrong. But this certainly isn't the same weight class. I think one of the big things that really hurt the division, in my opinion, was that you had a top rung of 5 world-class elite strawweight fighters, with those sort of 5 queens, as I call them, facing each other multiple times, a lot of those fights turning out to be must-watch classics. But in that time, Joanna retired, Rose moved to flyweight, Andrade moved to flyweight, Carla went off to have a baby. And that kind of left Weili on her own at the top. And the chasing pack, that sort of second rung of fighters, were artificially moved up, even though they were maybe, in reality, a step down compared to the skill level of Weili. So Amanda Lemos, Verna Janchi-Dorbe, Yan Xiaonan, good fighters, but I do think there is a gulf between Weili and the rest of the field. Also as well, as much as I respect Weili, as much as I appreciate she's a fantastic fighter, very entertaining to watch, her inactivity has been something which I do think has hurt the weight class, because it's very hard, in my opinion, to maintain a division's sort of momentum when the most important fight of the year only takes place once a year. And I don't know if that's a decision which Weili made on her own part. I don't know if that's the UFC choosing to keep her inactive. Because I did hear rumours that one of the plans they had for Weili was they were going to do her versus Alexa Grasso at Noche UFC. They were going to give her the chance to be a double champ. But Shev won that fight. Plans moved forward, and instead they moved on to this match here with Tatiana Suarez. I think if the UFC and Weili's team were a bit more open about why she's being kept on the shelf, I think the fan base wouldn't be as frustrated. I mean, people aren't necessarily turning on Weili, but it is that sort of niggle which people think, well, come on then, we do need to see a fight. So, I'm glad this fight's happening. I'm glad we're seeing Weili back in action, and it is going to be interesting to see how she handles the threat of Tatiana Suarez, because one of the things that we've seen from Weili over her time in the UFC has been a real change in approach when it comes to how she fights. Weili, very early on in her career, bit of an all-rounder, but the thing that really stood out for me was her being that kind of pocket brawler, getting into boxing range, throwing in those quick hooks. She would use the low kick especially to set up a lot of her combinations, and that's what played such a big role in the Joanna fight being as great as it was, because Joanna is a fantastic piston-like striker who likes to stay on the outside. The two complemented each other brilliantly. Ever since the Rose fight, where Weili got finished very, very early, she's gone grappling heavy. She started training with Henry Cejudo, and a lot of the time, people gave Valentina Shevchenko a lot of grief for how she fought in a match against Alexa Grasso at Noche UFC. Weili's kind of taken that same approach. She is a powerful wrestler, especially for this weight class, and a lot of her fights have come very grappling heavy. Yan Xiaonan, Amanda Lemos was pretty much on her back for about 90% of that match. But can she dare afford to do that against a 10-0 unbeaten fighter who, if not for illness, would probably have represented America in the Olympics, maybe even gone on to win a medal, Tatiana Suarez. Suarez has a lot of elements of unknown regarding how she's going to do in this fight, simply because we don't see her all that often. So her last fight came in August 2023. She fought Jessica Andrade on the Sandhagen versus Font card. And Jessica Andrade, in my opinion, even in 2025, is still a fantastic litmus test to how good of a fighter you actually are. Because we know there is a persistent, prominent threat that comes from her. And Suarez, facing this big adversity, facing a girl that can very easily put anyone's lights out, was able to neutralize the damage, take Andrade down, and then catch her in that guillotine. So, in my opinion, based off that fight, the quality is certainly there for Suarez to get this done. And I am going to be interested to see how Weili handles a strong grappling threat like that. You could say, yeah, well, what about Carla Esparza? I think Carla is somebody who tried to rely on her athleticism to set up her takedowns, whereas Suarez, in my opinion, is much more creative in how she sets up her takedown attempts. Plus, she has the reach to use those sort of high kicks to gauge distance and then get a shot. Carla, being about 5'0", not going to be able to do the same thing. So, and when we see Weili on her back in the past, as we saw when she fought Rose Namajunas, that fight was very divisive, the second fight between the two. But I've always been of the belief that part of the reason why Rose won that fight was when Rose was getting taken down, she was immediately trying to scramble, trying to get back to her feet, and also going for submissions off her back. Weili, in comparison, seemed a lot more content to stay where she was. So there are maybe some concerns that she might just be a little bit out of her element if Suarez is able to get the takedown. Plus as well, I get the feeling that a lot of people look at Tatiana Suarez's resume and look at that wrestling background and think all she is that kind of lane prey fighter. Like, kind of like, I heard some people refer to her as Khabib because she's just kind of this female Khabib. I actually think she's a lot sneakier when it comes to setting up a submission game than a lot of people give her credit for. One of the things I've noticed in particular is she kind of lures a lot of her opponents into a false sense of security. Because if you ever notice some of Suarez's fights, she'll kind of intentionally give up a little bit of pressure on the ground, and then the opponent realizing, oh, I'm fighting an Olympic level wrestler here. They're giving me a chance. I'm going to take it. I'm going to try and get up. And the moment you do, she's hooking the neck, she's jumping for the guillotine, and she's submitting you. She did that when she fought Montana De La Rosa. She did that when she fought Jessica Andrade. And I think she's going to try and do the same thing this time around. I definitely think that guillotine is a real potent weapon for Suarez. The question is, how long is that weapon going to be prevalent? My big X factor when it comes to this fight, because a lot of people are quite divided on who they think is going to win this one, I am much more comfortable in it being Weili than a lot of other people, I should say. Because I have very little confidence Tatiana Suarez is... I'm struggling with my words here. It's one of the hard things. I actually give Joe a real lot of leverage because it is very hard to speak into a camera on your own. I have serious concerns that Tatiana Suarez is going to be able to go 5 rounds. Because I remember the last time she went 5 rounds, I think she fought Nina Anzarov, and she dominated those first 2 rounds, but by the third, she was knackered. And Anzarov was able to pile on the pressure. She won that third round comfortably, and it was the work that Suarez did in the first 2 that ended up giving her the fight. Zhang Weili is a lot more dangerous than Nina Anzarov. And I kind of get this fear that if Suarez isn't able to do enough damage or get the finish in those first 2 rounds, I'm going to see Weili piling on the pressure, and I could possibly see a situation where she's teeing off against her against the fence, and Mark Goddard, Herb Dean, whoever, steps in. I'm picking Weili to win this one in the 3rd round, and it's going to be interesting to see what the UFC do in that regard. I do think the UFC want to do her as a double champ. I don't personally agree with it. The company do seem very high on the Weili hype train. And if Weili was to win, there's another break of the 35 curse. And no kind of Rocky and Bilal Muhammad kind of broke it. But there's always been the stigma surrounding that age. So it'll be interesting to see how the rest of the world reacts to that one. What I don't want to see though, and it's kind of the fear I have, regardless of who wins this fight, both of these ladies have built reputations for how inactive they are. Weili, whether it's through her own choice, whether it's through the UFC, Suarez has dealt with injuries. I've got this awful fear this could be the only strawweight fight this year. And again, a lot of the momentum and a lot of the sort of good feelings surrounding this weight class will be hurt by that. We need to see the belt defended a hell of a lot more. And also, one of my other bold predictions, we'll see how this plays out, is the next time this belt gets defended, it's going to be with Asmin Lucindo as the number 1 contender. She could very well be the future of this weight class, because you look at a lot of the girls at the top of the division, Weili being 35, I think Werner's 36, Jan's 34, even Suarez is 33. You've got a 24-year-old Lucinda who is charging up the rankings, taking on Amanda Lemos, who I think she's going to beat. That's the girl, in my opinion, who could very well give Weili her next big test. And finally, we focus on our main event of the evening as Dricus du Plessis defends his title for the 2nd time, and he's going to be taking on a familiar face in the form of the former champion Sean Strickland. Still found really strange to say that Sean Strickland was a former champion. So the last time these two fought came at UFC 297 in a main event which, when it first happened, a lot of people were very, very high on. People calling it, hey, this could be one of the fights of the year. It was an epic brawl. Very good fight, very close fight, but I do think a lot of that was recency bias. That being said, it came after, let's be honest, the greatest moment in the history of our sport. big Raquel Pennington fans here. Very close fight. What was very interesting to note in regards to the statistical side of things, Sean Strickland landed a hell of a lot more shots than Dricus du Plessis. But I think DDP was a lot more efficient in terms of how many strikes he threw compared to how many he landed. But also he was mixing it up a lot more. A lot more shots to the body, a lot more leg kicks, and also the big X factor when it came to this fight, and it has been a talking point when it comes to this matchup, was that DDP was using the wrestling. Strickland making a big deal going into this fight that he doesn't want any of that wrestling, which makes me think that DDP is going to be even more grappling heavy when it comes to this one. So we'll start off with DDP, who comes into this fight with probably one of the biggest wins of his career in the form of Israel Adesanya, and a fight that, in my opinion, properly highlighted to the world that DDP is a lot more legitimate, finally, than people want to give him credit for. We have a guy with a 22-2 record here. His 2 losses came before he came into the UFC. A loss against Roberto Soldic, who had that brief run over in ROM Championship that didn't go all that well for him, but he also holds a win over him in their first encounter back in 2018, and also former UFC fighter Gareth McClellan, which came in his 5th pro fight over in South Africa. As well as that, there were wins over Adesanya, Strickland, as we mentioned before, Robert Whittaker, Derek Brunson, Darren Till, Brad Tavares, Trevin Giles. So, in my opinion, a lot of very solid names. We're not going to be talking about DDP as one of the greatest middleweights of all time at this moment, don't get me wrong, but he has certainly proven, in my opinion, there was a lot more method to the madness than people want to admit. In terms of Sean Strickland, 29-6 record, and probably one of the most frustrating fighters in that middleweight division, it must be, to fight against. Wins over Paulo Costa that got him this title shot. Adesanya, as mentioned before, Abus Magomedov, a well-aging win up against Nasruddin Imavov, along with Jack Manson, Uriah Hall, Christoph Jotko, and another well-aging win up against Brendan Allen, which was, I believe, also his most recent finish in the UFC. Came very close to one up against Adesanya. So when it comes to the X's and O's regarding this fight, we'll start with DDP first and foremost. DDP, when you look at DDP and you see the way his fight stance is, when you see the way he breathes, you think this guy's just a bit of a muscular unit that just can't go the distance. But he is a lot more cardio efficient than people want to give it credit for, especially since he sorted out his nose. So DDP likes to mix it up when it comes to the striking, and his striking style, it does generate a lot more power than people think. He kind of has this real hunched, very high guard. It makes him look a bit cumbersome. One of the things I do notice that DDP likes to do a lot is to invite pressure on his opponent. He likes to get up against the fence for defensive wrestling reasons, and also maybe to lure his opponents into a bit of a false sense of security. And the moment people get too close, they try throwing a few combinations. There's DDP exploding with this, you know, those kind of boxing gloves with like the checkered arm that just keeps coming out. That's kind of how DDP throws. And we saw him knock out Marcus Perez doing that exact same thing. It does generate a lot of power. It catches people by surprise. DDP, he does have a parrying guard, which is very good. And what we've seen recently when he fought Robert Whittaker and in the first fight against Strickland, he is a much more potent grappler than people want to give him credit for. You actually even have to look at his record. People try and think that DDP, because he had this background in kickboxing, that he's only just a kickboxer. I mean, no. I mean, you look at the guy's record. You got him here. 9 KOs, 11 submissions. And those submissions as well, very torque-based. Face cranks. You've also got you've got a guillotine when he was fighting over in EFC. Quite a few guillotines. That's actually a bit of a potent weapon that he has. People try and make him out to be this kind of sort of stocky kickboxer. There's a lot more to the guy than that. In terms of Sean Strickland, you kind of make the argument looking at him on paper. Very grappling heavy when he first fought. He had a wrestling background. Since then, he has got this awkward sort of cardio. He's kind of perfected that kind of cardio kickboxing style, throwing a lot of teep kicks and a lot of straight movement, a lot of forward pressure. And as we discussed before, when we discussed Yuri versus Jamal Hill last month, kind of that forward pressure. Like, in any walk of life, pressure can break people. Whether that's a mental pressure, whether that's a physical pressure. If you have a guy continually marching forward, just constantly keeping you on the torch, not giving you any chance to gain any kind of momentum, it can stress you out. It can frustrate you. We saw that when we fought Adesanya. Adesanya just could not get any kind of movement going because he had Strickland just harassing him throughout the fight. Not necessarily a fan of Sean Strickland, but any guy who rises to the occasion when everyone's writing him off deserves credit. In terms of Strickland's fighting style as well, that's the big X's and O's in my opinion, is that forward pressure. The one concern I have when it comes to Sean Strickland though is that all that he has? One of the big things that won DDP the first fight, in my opinion, was the way that he was able to change things up, not just rely on striking, not just get involved in this sort of cardio kickboxing match. He was the one that went to the wrestling. Can Sean Strickland do that? Can Sean Strickland change it up? I'm not 100% sure. I actually remember reading a quote from one of, I think it was either Eric Nixick or John Wood or someone around that sort of Vegas training scene. And they said that Sean Strickland's style is very hard to deal with first time around. But once you know exactly what he's going to do, the fights get easier. And I kind of get the feeling that DDP has the more potent weapons. He has more things he can go back to. And also, based on what Strickland's been saying, maybe he's a little bit wary of the grappling. So I expect DDP to go wrestling heavy again. I don't think Strickland's going to change enough to try and erase some of those weaknesses. Why should he? Like, Sean Strickland's found this style that's built him so much success during the Apex era, got him a belt. I don't think he's going to be savvy enough to try and change that, but you look at some of the people he's working with, he's got a smart team around him. With that being said, I'm picking DDP to win this one. I think it's going to be another decision, and I think I'm going to pick, say, 4 rounds to 1, DDP wins this one and retains his title. Then comes the interesting factor. And also as well, I know it's not the right thing to try and think about title fights of the future when this happens. I would be more interested to see DDP versus Hamzat than I would Strickland. I think if Strickland wins the title and that fight happens next, we get a fairly straightforward result. But DDP being that strong, that physical, having this ability to survive a lot of adversity. We saw him almost pull himself into full mount when he got rocked against Derek Brunson and still managed to survive that. I think that would be a more interesting fight. I think DDP has a much better chance of surviving the round 1 onslaught. And if it goes into a second with that kind of power, that could be a very interesting fight to see. But that's a long way into the future. So that's been a breakdown of the main and the core main events of UFC 312. Once again, I want to wish a big apology. We weren't able to do a full-on preview show of this card. Joe, he sends his apologies. He is getting better though. He tells me, don't worry, Karl, I will be back on Sunday to do a breakdown of UFC 312. One of the things he has done before he got unwell though, was he sent us over the next video for the retro review series. So I'm splicing that all together. It should be on INC Live in just a few days time, either this week or next week. And another retro review has also been lined up for us because we ran a poll for February asking people to name their classic card headlined by one of the greatest middleweights of all time, Dan Henderson. And we're going to be making a venture to Strikeforce as we look at his legendary war with Fedor Emelianenko, as well as core main event as Misha Tate takes on Marlis Kunin for the women's bantamweight title. And women's MMA will also be on the mantle when it comes to March's retro review, because we're going to be celebrating the career of one of the greatest women's fighters of all time, Chris Cyborg Justino. We have 4 classic events headlined by the great Brazilian legend herself. The poll is on the main channel as we speak. Where will we be going? Will we be going to Strikeforce, Invicta, the UFC, or making our first venture to Bellator? So the poll is up there right now. I want to say once again a big thank you to everyone who has been tuning in. Apologies this isn't the proper thing, but this is kind of consider this a bit of a substitute for yourself. Hopefully it's played its part. If you have any opinions, if you disagree at any of my own personal takes, post those in the comments. My name's been Karl Bainbridge, this has been the INC. Thank you very much for watching and enjoy UFC 312.